Sega had just built one of the most unlikely turnarounds in coin-op history. A company assembled from the wreckage of a banned military contractor, 5 years old and already profitable. David Rosen sold it anyway, to a conglomerate that also owned Paramount Pictures. What Golf and Western actually wanted wasn't a movie studio's neighbor. It was a foothold in an industry that hadn't fully existed yet, and Rosen was betting that Sega needed a parent company's weight to get there first. Another empire, another case. Here's what really happened. In 1969, Sega Enterprises became a subsidiary of Gulf and Western Industries, the same conglomerate that owned Paramount Pictures. David Rosen stayed on, running Sega's operations, but the company itself now answered to an American parent, with businesses in film, publishing, and manufacturing spanning far beyond arcades. The exact terms of that sale aren't fully documented in the historical record. What is clear is the reasoning behind it. Sega needed capital and scale to keep growing its manufacturing and distribution, and going public alone in Japan wasn't a realistic path yet. Attaching itself to a parent company like Gulf and Western solved that problem instantly. Sega in this era was still mostly a coin-op, an electromechanical company. Games like Periscope, gun games, driving cabinets, and in 1971, Winner, which Sega calls Japan's first domestically produced pinball machine. The shift toward what we'd recognize as video arcade gaming didn't fully arrive until 1973, with a Pong-style title called Pongtron. It wasn't an invention, it was Sega learning to compete in a format it hadn't built. Sega had the corporate backing now. What it didn't have yet was a way to build video games at scale in America. And that gap was about to get filled by a company that almost wasn't named what it's known as today. By the late 1970s, Sega faced a real problem. Building a proper video game manufacturing operation in the United States from scratch was slow and expensive. According to Gene Candelore, a figure tied to the company at the time, Sega's leadership made a different call. Rather than build the factory themselves, they'd simply buy a company that already had one. On September 29, 1978, Sega acquired Gremlin Industries, a San Diego arcade manufacturer. Gremlin's own name had a strange origin worth pausing on. Its founders wanted to call it Grindelman Industry, a combination of their two last names. A Delaware state clerk misheard the name over the phone during incorporation. The company became Gremlin instead, and nobody ever changed it back. After the acquisition, games released under the label Gremlin Sega or Sega Gremlin, including Head On, a maze-driving game built around collecting dots on a grid. Some in the industry, including Gremlin co-founder Frank Fogelman, have said they believe Head On directly influenced Pac-Man's maze chase design. That's a belief, not a confirmed admission from Pac-Man's own creator, but it's a claim worth taking seriously, given who's making it. Sega now had American manufacturing. What it needed next was someone who actually understood how to sell in Japan, and that person came from a company Sega didn't even build. In 1978, Sega announced it would acquire Esco Boeki, known as Esco Trading, a coin-op distribution company founded and run by a businessman named Hayao Nakayama. The acquisition completed in January 1979, with Sega taking full ownership of Esco stock. In an interview from that period, Nakayama himself confirmed the deal and said he'd continue managing Esco's business for the time being. This wasn't an instant handover of power. Nakayama didn't walk into Sega and immediately take over. He entered through distribution and marketing, and his influence over the company grew from there, not all at once, but steadily, over the years that followed. By 1982, with Gremlin's manufacturing capacity and Nakayama's distribution network both inside the company, Sega's revenue reportedly reached $214 million. a figure that appears in multiple industry retrospectives, well ahead of a softer, less certain claim that revenue had already crossed $100 million by 1979. A band company's wreckage, a photo booth salesman, a mismanufactured name from a phone call, a distributor who wasn't even trying to run Sega yet. That's not a company with a plan. That's a company that kept absorbing whatever worked. In 1978, Taito released Space Invaders, and it reshaped the entire Japanese arcade market almost overnight. It's tempting to say the game specifically damaged Sega, but the evidence for that direct hit is weaker than the popular version of this story suggests. Sega's restructuring through Gremlin and Esco was already underway before Space Invaders became a phenomenon. What Space Invaders did do was raise the stakes for everyone. Video games weren't a side experiment anymore. They were the entire competitive battlefield, and Sega cobbled together from a photo booth business, a banned military contractor's wreckage, and 2 acquisitions, bought mostly for what they had brought with them, was now positioned to actually compete on it. Nakayama's slow rise through Sega in this era set up the partnership that would define the company's next major chapter, the one where he and David Rosen would eventually lead a buyout of Sega itself, from Gulf and Western, taking the company they'd assembled piece by piece back into their own hands. Sega in this decade wasn't built by a singular vision. It was built by a sale to a movie studio's parent company, a factory it decided to buy instead of build, a name that survived a wrong turn at an incorporation, and a distributor who wasn't even trying to run the place yet. Somehow, all of it worked. Another empire, another case. Here's what really happened.